Okay, so let's imagine you're dreaming up a brand new system or upgrading what you have. How much system do you need? I mean, what's the size of your venue? How many channels do you need? There are a myriad of different systems, and for the most part, it's really kind of a mix and match proposition. But before we get into specifics, let's kind of look at an overview of your typical sound system. Now, this may be an oversimplification, but basically we have sound sources that come from stage, although they may not be limited to instruments on stage. They could be things like an audio feed from your video announcements. So whether they come from stage or they come from a computer sitting 3 feet to your right of the front of house position, all of them come in and make their way into a mixer. And then you can add effects to that, and then they go out to amps, and then they go out to front of house speakers. Now, the further we get into this, what I'm finding more than anything, you're not dealing with an analog mixer like this. More often than not, you're dealing with a digital mixer. And apart from some of the other benefits of a digital mixer and things like you've got a nice big screen there, you also have presets and instant recall and things like that. Quite often those effects will now be built right in. And then speaking of things being built right in, instead of the power amps going out and powering passive speakers, quite often a lot of speakers now will have those amps built in. So with a digital mixer and most modern front of house speakers, the actual connections become very, very simple. It's really sound sources go into the mixer, and then left and right go out to your speakers with those built-in amps. Of course, a lot of this may, it might be an oversimplification of what your system will be, but for the most part, it really comes down to that. The sound comes from a sound source, like a vocal mic or a keyboard, or even an audio feed from your video announcements. They all go into a mixer and then they move on from there. But how do you get all of those sources from your stage out to your mixer? The easiest way, of course, is just to put a bunch of cables between your sound sources and then your mixer. But when you think about how far that is away, just having an unruly bundle of cables like that is not really an efficient way to go. So quite often you'll be using some sort of snake, and that can be something like a fan-to-fan snake, and you can see both ends of that snake fan out to a bunch of connectors that can go from your sound sources on stage all the way out to your mixer. A more elegant kind of situation would be a fan to box. So that box would live on stage, you could plug everything in, and then that all comes out in a single multi-core cable which fans out to go into your mixer. Another way, very close to cousin to that, is a wall plate, which is in more permanent installations where you'll have that installed on the wall or on the floor, and then it's basically the same as a fan to box, but it's, instead of it being a freestanding box, it's actually attached to a wall or attached to the floor. And a more modern solution is something like an I/O box like this. And the great benefit of those is that instead of having these big, thick, multi-core cables, you can just have a single network cable. So all of these inputs are going to be going into some sort of mixer. You could have a small mixer, 6 or 8 channels, something like that. A medium mixer up to 32 channels, and then a large mixer if you wanted to add more than 32 channels. And when I say large, it doesn't have to be actually of large footprint. Back in the day when you had, say 48 channels, a typical mixer would be, 6-8 feet wide, because there are discrete channels for every input. In a digital mixer, you can get the same amount of those inputs in something that's only maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. So let's start to think about how many inputs that we would need in your typical setup, and they start adding up. If we were to take something like a typical drum kit that had a kick, snare, hi-hat, 3 toms and 2 overheads, and then add some vocals. You've got a lead vocal and 3 backing vocals, and then say 2 guitars and 1 bass, and then a keyboard. This is a fairly small setup. But guess how many inputs this is in this small setup? You're already at 16 inputs. So if you start adding things like choir mics, or more than one keyboard, and if you want to go stereo on those keyboards and then add some more acoustic guitars and more backing vocals, you can see how you can really start racking up the number of inputs that you'll need. So when you start looking at which type of mixer that you want, here are some of the questions you might want to be asking yourself. It's like, how many inputs do I need? Just grab a piece of paper and start adding them all up. And here's the thing. Start thinking about the future in here. I mean, if you've added up all your inputs and you've got 24, and you start looking around and say, okay, I need something that'll handle 24. Well, I would start thinking about something that would have at least 32 channels, because you know what it's like. You start adding inputs over time. If your band wants to get better, bigger and better, and maybe you have some guest acts that come in that will need more and more inputs, start kind of future-proofing your choice there in terms of your inputs. So err on the side of more inputs than you actually need. Then you go on from there. Is it going to be powered versus non-powered? Now, this is not something you would find in the medium mixer or the large mixer in this thing. Pretty much any serious mixer out there is not going to be powered. But I'm talking about small systems that you might want to have in the youth area, something like that. Some of them can be powered mixers, so that's something to consider there. Is there going to be internal effects? In the old days of where everything was analog, it was quite rare to find internal effects, but most digital mixers will have internal effects built in. And then how many EQ bands? If you've got one mixer that just has bass and treble, or versus another one that has 5 bands of EQ, then obviously the more bands of EQ you have, the more flexibility you'll have. It may not be something that you think about right now, but as you get more and more adept to mixing, the more complexity and the more room to grow you'll want to have in terms of EQ bands. And then how many aux sends are you going to need? In a standard analog mixer, an aux send was a way to send out to effects and then also send out to monitors. Now we'll talk about digital and analog mixers a little bit later on, but basically you want to think about how many aux sends you want if you want to be using external effects and external monitoring as well, because all of those get sent down aux sends. There's some exceptions to that when we get into personal monitoring and networking and things like that, but basically think about things like that. And then also subgroups. Are you going to be grouping some of your input channels together, things like DCAs, like standard subgroups or DCAs there. And then analog or digital. The further we get along this course, the less that becomes an issue. Most of the consoles nowadays are digital consoles. But I mean, if you're getting something just for a coffee shop or a small conference room, you might want to choose an analog mixer instead. So let's look at discrete systems where you have a separate mixer, separate amps and speakers. And the good thing about that is you can mix and match. You can have the amps bigger than the speakers bigger than the amps. But basically the ratio you should be looking at is the amps should be around twice the RMS ratings of the speakers. RMS is just a fancy way of saying average. So if you had a speaker that was rated at 200 watts RMS, you'd want to drive that with an amp that's doing about 400 watts RMS. And typically most amps, if they are a stereo amp, then each amp channel should be around twice the RMS ratings of the speakers. So 350 watt speaker, you should be driving that about 400 watt RMS. If it was 500 watts, then that would be 1,000 watts RMS per channel. Now, another thing to think of is that you can sometimes have amps that are built into a mixer. And what that allows you to do is that you can have passive speakers, and then your mixer and your amp is built right in. There are less and less of these. Certainly, these are not around the place when you get into larger, more professional setups. But for coffee shops and conference rooms, you might have a mixer like this that is a powered mixer, and the same thing will go there. So 200 watts RMS there. You wouldn't want to have any speakers that were, you'd want them to be around 100 watts RMS right there. Okay, so then if we're moving on where we have the speakers actually have the built-in amp, so rather than those amps being built into the mixer, they're actually built into the amps. What's the great benefit of that? Well, nobody knows better how to match an amp to a speaker than the manufacturer of the speaker. So if they can be built in, then that makes it a whole lot easier, because then you just need to just take the outputs of those of that mixer and just go straight into those speakers, and then you can have things like a very, very small powered speaker like that, like a mid-size or like a speaker on a stick setup, or you can have a very, very large one. You don't have to change the mixer at all. Just the output of the mixer is coming out, and it just gets amplified at that speaker position, and that amp has been rated perfectly for those speakers, and it's basically plug and play. So here are some of the systems that you would typically see. If you went into a very small setup, like your typical coffee shop or your conference room, you might want to do a mixer, an amp, or a speaker in one. Up the top, we have an example of just a little Mackie speaker on a stick that has a mixer built in. It's everything you need, and it's great for a little coffee shop or small announcements, something like that. The one on the bottom has a powered mixer with some satellite speakers there that all just kind of locks together in something that you can carry with one hand, the Fender Passport there. Now, in terms of a medium speaker, this is where amps being built into mixers really go away. You tend to just always have a mixer that is not powered, and it goes out to what I would call speakers on a stick, and they might have some subs there as well. And then in a much larger situation, you have a lot more inputs, a lot more flexibility in the mixer, and then you would have some powered speakers like an array and also some subs as well. If you have sophisticated line arrays, you'll also have a fair bit of signal processing that might live in a rack-mounted processor, or more often than not, they're actually built right into the speakers. Now, the front-of-house speaker systems are becoming more and more sophisticated and are normally controlled by a computer to set them up in terms of their dispersion patterns and amazing things like beam steering and vertical coverage. Now, the signal flow that we tend to think of when we think of a sound system is that we mix at the front of house position, and then we send that sound to the front of house speakers so our audience can hear that performance. But unless you're a musician, you may not immediately think of another crucial signal flow, which is back to the stage. Musicians need to hear themselves. The vocalist needs to hear the keyboards and guitar so they can stay in tune. The bass player needs to hear the drums so he can play in time. Everybody needs to hear each other so that they play together as a team. And all of this is quite different from a front of house mix for the audience in two big ways. First of all, the front of house speakers are pointed outwards to the audience. So it's you may not have thought of this, but it's quite difficult for the musicians to hear themselves on stage. They can't hear that mix. And secondly, while you have a complete mix of the whole band, like you would hear on a record, in the front of house mix, the musicians have totally different requirements in terms of what they want to hear. Like the bass player might just want to hear the drummer and a bit of the lead vocal. The backing singers might want a ton of the lead vocal and keys and maybe just a little bit of a kick and snare and hat to stay in time. Maybe the guitarist just wants some kick, snare and bass and lead, maybe no backing vocals. The thing to take away from this is that while you have one front of house mix, you can have many mixes that go back to the musicians on stage. Kind of looks like this. You have your musicians on stage and then your front of house position out in the house, and you get all of that stuff coming in on from stage, and you mix that all, and that goes out to your front of house speakers, which points out towards the audience. The problem with that is the musicians really can't hear that. We need to fold some of that back, either through some on-stage monitors like this or some in-ear monitors. Now, that can be fed from either the front of house mixer there, or it can also be fed from a monitor mixer. Sometimes you'll have a split of all of those channels coming from the stage, and they will go out to the front of house mixer, and a copy of those will go out to a monitor mixer off to stage left or stage right. And that way a dedicated person can mix that and send different mixes to all the musicians on stage there. Or you can have, more often than not now, it's a very handy solution, is personal monitor mixers, and these little boxes sit right on stage, and each person can have their own mix, and it's easy for them just to dial up. I want some more background vocal, I want less kick drum, I can do whatever I want. That's the great thing about them, is that each musician on stage can now adjust their own monitor mix. So again, those mixes go back on stage either through those on-stage monitors or through in-ear monitors, and they can either be controlled from the front of house mixer, a monitor mixer off to the side, or those personal monitor mixers on stage per musician. Now, in terms of microphones, there are a lot of choices. We have head-worn ones, lavaliers, and handheld in both wired and wireless ones, things like drum overheads. Each one is built with a specific purpose in mind. A mic like this is really great for kick drum applications because it has a large diaphragm for low frequencies and can take a very high SPL level, which is important in that application. Stick your head inside a kick drum all night, it's very loud. And then we have our trusty SM57, which has basically remained unchanged since its introduction over 50 years ago. These guys can absolutely take a beating, and they're great for snare drums, guitar cabinets, and even vocals. Now, if you want a little bit more definition, you might want to go with a condenser mic like this. Condenser mics tend to have a much better top end than your average microphone like a SM57 that we saw a moment ago. So some of the variables are, what kind of mic is it? Is it going to be a dynamic or a condenser or even a ribbon microphone? If your mic is a dynamic mic like this, it's basically a thin diaphragm sitting on a coil of wire over a magnet. Now, if you slept through science labs, you might have missed the correlation between magnets and electricity, which says that if you move a wire over a magnet, that'll generate a small amount of electrical energy. So when you sing into a microphone, it vibrates that diaphragm, moves the coil across a magnetic field, and generates a signal that comes down the wire and ultimately does the reverse of that at the end of the line at your speakers. The electrical signal creates a magnetic field and excites another moving coil that moves those speakers back and forth and sends sound waves back to you. So a dynamic microphone is basically a speaker in a reverse, and it requires no power to operate it, just plug and play. A condenser mic, like this one here, requires power in either a battery pack or more commonly using the phantom power that you send down a microphone cable. Now, one thing to consider is the pickup pattern of the microphone. There are a number of different microphone pickup patterns, but we'll look at the two big ones here, which is the cardioid and the omnidirectional. If you look over on the left-hand side, the cardioid, there's a Shure SM57. That has a rejection zone on the back, and it naturally rejects sounds coming in from the rear. It's very sensitive on the top of the microphone, so it'll pick up your vocal, but it will reject sound coming in from the rear. Not perfectly, but you'll notice that it drops right off. Where on the right-hand side, the omnidirectional, it picks up sound in all direction. Now, why is that so good in terms of a cardioid on the left-hand side? Well, imagine that cardioid. You are singing into that, and at your feet there is a on-stage monitor there. You'll notice that you'll be able to hear the monitor, but the monitor is placed at your feet right at the place where your microphone is the least sensitive. So the microphone will pick up your voice, but it will kind of reject most of that feedback that could really come in off an omnidirectional mic. By the way, we talked about phantom power. Make sure you don't send phantom power down a line to a ribbon mic. you just might fry it. Check the documentation that came with your mic for details. Now, in terms of deciding whether you're going to go wired or wireless, here's a few guidelines. Whenever you want your performer to have unrestricted movement, a wireless is going to be your best choice. A wireless system obviously calls for a transmitting microphone and then a receiver, so the costs usually go up from there. And you'll also, when you think about it, you're going to have to budget for consumables like 9-volt batteries on that mic, on those mics, as well as extra troubleshooting steps to make sure it's working together. Usually, when you have set your frequencies up, you really shouldn't need to touch them again. But when you have a dozen or more wireless systems, this can become a little bit more complicated. But that's kind of like why in a small club or a youth ministry, you'll probably be dealing with conventional, wired microphones. You just plug them in and they're ready to go. And the other benefit is they're very inexpensive. If you break one, you can get another SM57 like this for under $100. So the rule of thumb is go with wired mics for the most part, and then leave the wireless for certainly specialist situations like your lead vocalists and also speakers on stage, and then have some for backing vocalists and other people as your budget allows. Now, in years gone by, you would have had to allocate a certain amount of money in your budget to external effects, things like reverb and delay to add space or depth, compressors to level out your signal, noise gates to clean up your signal, and then things like graphic EQs to sculpt your sound and help eliminate feedback. It was quite common back in the day to see racks and racks of outboard gear, and then you've got to have all the cables that went along with it. But with the growing rise of digital mixers that have all those effects built in, there is less and less need for outboard effects. Now, it's also helped in a number of different ways. Number one is the ease of use of these effects. Instead of reaching down to a remote rack, all of this can be controlled, stored and recalled on your mixer's screen. And the other massive benefit is financial. A mixer like the one we've been looking at, the M32, has a compressor and gate on every channel as well as subgroups and aux sends. You would spend, I would say, probably over $10,000 on just the compressors and gates that are built in here if you went with a physical analog rack gear that you would need to replace. And here's how it normally went down back in the old days. You'd say, well, I can only afford 4 compressors, so I'll just place them on the kick, snare, bass, and lead vocal because I'm not made of money. In the digital consoles we've been looking at, you don't need to include expensive electronic components in there, because once your signal is digital inside there, it's just math inside the box.